recognize the principles for which it stands. Department 1 is now in session. Honorable Mark E. Wyndham, Judge, presiding.
Please be seated, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back to Department 1. People versus Robert Durst. All of our jurors are present. Mr. Durst is present. Mr. Chesnov, Mr. DeGuerin. I see Mr. Ray is here. And Mr. Balian and Mr. Henderson, Mr. Miyata, and Mr. Lewin. Very well. The people may call their next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The parties have reached a couple of more stipulations.
Thank you.
If it's agreeable with the court, I'll read one, and Mr. Chesnov will read one.
Yes.
Okay. I have this stipulation. I marked this one as People's 53.
Yes.
And it is a 3-page document. The party stipulates the following. In lieu of the live testimony of Jeanette McKee, the parties stipulate that the people may read into evidence the police report dated October 28, 2015, documenting her statement. This police report is attached to People's 53. On December 28, 2015, witness Jeanette McKee was interviewed telephonically by Deputy District Attorney John Lewin and Deputy District Attorney Habib Bailey. I, Detective E. Camacho, was present for the interview. The interview was recorded. The following is a paraphrased summary of the interview. McKee advised that she did not remember that Kathie Durst was a student at Einstein Medical College. She remembered that Kathie was married to a wealthy person and lived on the west side. McKee also recalled that Kathie was already a registered nurse and wanted to become a doctor. McKee could not recall how she gained knowledge of Kathie's personal life. McKee started working at Einstein in 1978 as a secretary, but was later promoted to program coordinator, co-coordinator. While she was working at Einstein, she was not married and used her maiden name of Freeman. She worked from 1978 to 1982. Her primary assignment was an assistant to Dr. Albert Cooperman. Most phone calls which came to Cooperman's office would be answered by McKee. McKee advised that although Dr. Cook's office was just across the hallway, she did not answer Dr. Cook's calls. Dr. Cook had his own staff. McKee advised that it was out of the ordinary for a student to call the office of the dean to report an illness. McKee believed that the student would normally call the hospital site coordinator for the rotation or clinic where they were assigned. McKee did not remember ever keeping track of sick days for the medical students. McKee also had no memory of ever receiving calls from students who were sick. If a student were to call or come to Dr. Cooperman's office, it will be more likely regarding a school scheduling issue. Although McKee recalls speaking with Kathie Durst, she did not have enough contact with Kathie to recognize Kathie's voice over the telephone. McKee advised that she was very busy while working at the school and did not have time to socialize with students outside of work. She also found some of the students to be contemptuous towards her, even though she was close in age to them. McKee advised that she has not seen much television or press regarding the Durst case, although she stated that she was aware it was in the news. McKee stated that she did not remember getting a phone call from Kathie Durst, and she believes that given the press attention at that time, she would have remembered doing so. McKee also stated that Dr. Cooperman might have picked up the phone himself if she were not in the office. McKee has no memory of discussions about Kathie Durst's disappearance with Dr. Cooperman regarding the call. McKee does not believe that she was ever interviewed by law enforcement. Prior to this interview, McKee had no prior knowledge that Kathie Durst allegedly called Dr. Cooperman. McKee does not remember any negative interaction with Kathie Durst. McKee was not aware that Robert Durst was in custody for Susan Berman's murder. And Mr. Chesnoff will read the next one.
What's the number on it?
So mark it as People's 54.
It'll be People's 54, Your Honor.
Yes, People's 54.
Thank you. The parties stipulate to the following. In 1982, Darrell Otto was a state trooper working for the New York State Police. On February 4, 1982, Trooper Otto was assigned to work at the Brewster Area Barracks in Westchester County. On that date, in the early morning hours before 7 a.m., Trooper Otto received a call from someone identifying herself as Gilberte Najami, address 7 Sugar Street, Newtown, Connecticut, telephone 203-426-6994. Ms. Najami called to report Kathleen Durst missing. Ms. Najami was upset and, based on the tone of her voice, seemed very excited and concerned about Kathleen Durst's whereabouts. Trooper Otto wrote a report which states as follows. Ms. Najami said that she had last seen Mrs. Durst when Mrs. Durst left Ms. Najami's home on the evening of 1/31/81. Ms. Najami said she spoke with Robert Durst, and he said he put Kathleen on a train that night for Manhattan. Kathleen attended Albert Einstein Medical School in Manhattan, and Gilberte said she checked with friends at school, and Kathleen had not been there all week. Gilberte said the Dursts are going through a divorce, and that Kathleen had been the victim of physical abuse by her husband in the last couple of weeks. Gilberte said that the divorce involves a large sum of money. Gilberte said that Robert Durst is vice president of the Durst Organization, also known as Van Dorn Realty, telephone 212-586-3131. Gilberte said that Kathleen Durst wants half of the estate. Second part of the stipulation is this. On February 9, 1982, Detective Michael Struck of the New York Police Department, along with other detectives, interviewed both Bill and Ruth Mayer at their home in South Salem, Connecticut. Detective Struck then wrote a police report which states as follows. Quote, we all entered the home of William Mayer and interviewed him and his wife Ruth. 914-763-5600 and 914-763-8100. They stated on January 30, 82, that Durst came up to their home and that sometime in the afternoon, Bob came over to the Mayer home and borrowed 2 hats. They both stated that they did not see Kathie in person that weekend, and that was the only time that they saw Bob. The Myers further stated that they went out on Sunday, January 31, 1982, when they returned home at about 21:30 hours, they don't recall seeing the Durst car. They further stated on February 3, 82, at about 1900 to 2000 hours, they invited Bob over for a drink and that he declined, stating he had a cold. Mr. Mayer further informed us that on Saturday after Christmas was the last time that Bob came over and had drinks with them. They further stated that Gilberte was the most common visitor of Kathie and that Kathie was not here lately. Mr. Mayer further stated that the nearest market within walking distance is Size and that there is no public phone in between. He could add nothing further at this time. At this time, I looked over the exterior of the Durst home with investigators and observed a broken window on the rear patio. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Chesnoff, and the court accepts both stipulations. Thank you. Mr. Bellion?
Thank you, Your Honor. The people now call, through a stipulated conditional examination video, Peter Halperin, witness Peter Halperin. May I mark the video as People's 55
Yes.
and the transcript as People's 55A?
Yes.
We will mark the exhibits when it's completed. Can I just have one moment to move the TV?
Yes.
right spot here.
May we begin, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. We provided a transcript for the court as well as court orders of the defense. I'll give one of the defense right now. And we have for the jurors. Which one's the jurors?
So-
Whoever wants one, they raise it.
Yes, right.
We're all good. They're subtitled, as are all the videos.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give and the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Sir, if you can just pull the base of the mic to the center. Thank you. Speak into it. Is that chair okay?
Yeah.
Please state and spell your first and last name.
Dr. Peter, P-E-T-E-R, Halperin, H-A-L-P-E-R-I-N.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Halperin, how old are you?
Well, I'm 66.
And can you tell me what is your current occupation?
I'm a psychiatrist.
I'm sorry.
I'm a psychiatrist.
And, doctor, are you currently still working or are you retired?
I still practice.
And how long have you been a psychiatrist?
Well, since 1986 is when I graduated my residency.
Where did you go to medical school?
Albert Einstein.
And is that in the Bronx, New York?
It is.
And when I say the name Kathie Durst, is that a name you recognize?
It is.
Can you tell me how you recognize that name?
She was a classmate of mine at Albert Einstein in the same year that I went.
And if you can remember, approximately how big were your classes at that time in terms of the amount of med students who were in each year?
In the range of 100.
Was Kathie somebody that you knew well early on in your medical school career?
No.
Can you tell me, did you get to know her a little bit better later?
Very good.
And can you tell me where did you have contact with her, if you specifically remember right now?
Over the years, I bumped into her a few times in or around classes, and I actually had conversations with her twice because we both happened to be shopping at the same food store in Manhattan called Zabar's. We had a few conversations then.
And I think that a court report might need a spelling on Zabar.
Z-A-B-A-R-S.
It's famous. Was
If you don't get bagels,
that an easy one? I didn't know what that was.
bagels in there.
Dr. Halperin, can you tell me in terms of how Einstein Medical School worked when you went there? The first 2 years, were the medical students primarily in classes, attending lectures?
Yes.
And then the next 2 years would be what we would call rotation, is that correct?
Yes, clinical rotations, yeah.
And when someone was in their 4th year of medical school, towards the end of their 4th year, were they, in terms of their rotations, given more substantial responsibilities?
Yes.
Do you recall, were you and Kathie on the radiology rotation at Montefiore Hospital in December of 1981?
We were.
And you know what, can you spell, court reporter might have it, but not this one. Montefiore, can you spell that?
M-O-N-T-E-F-O-I-R-E.
And I should have asked you, doctor, in addition to your psychiatric practice, have you held any academic positions?
Yes.
Can you please explain what those were or are?
Well, they all involve teaching, appointments at several places. For a few years I was, and these are clinical teacher responsibilities at Harvard Medical School. But the major academic period was about 12 years where I was directing medical student education in psychiatry at Stony Brook Medical School, and also had a lot of interaction with the general medical curriculum during those years.
And in your position at Stony Brook, would that have meant that you would have been aware of what the procedures and policies were regarding medical students and rotations, etc.?
Yes.
And I would assume that having gone to Einstein when you were there back in the early 80s and late 70s, were you also aware of what the policies and procedures were for medical students involved in rotations?
Yes.
As I sit here today, do you have a memory of that December of 81 radiology rotation?
Yes.
And can you tell me, prior to that time, to the best of your memory, how much contact had you and Kathie Durst had?
Extremely little. I'm not sure if I remember more than 2 conversations at Zay bars, and just knowing that I bumped into her and said hello several times over the years prior. It had almost no contact.
During that rotation, if you can recall, how many medical students, other than you and Kathie, would have been doing that rotation at the same time?
Maybe 10, I would guess.
And during that rotation, did you become a little bit closer and have more contact with Kathie?
In one particular day.
And can you describe what happened that day that you remember?
We were having sort of a conference with the radiology attending, doing, sort of questions and answers. And he asked her a question, and she didn't answer, but she looked extremely anxious and frightened. And he asked her, kind of why can't you answer the question? I thought in the spirit of it's such an easy question. And she was so frightened looking that I sort of said out loud, can you see where I think she's kind of upset or anxious? And then after the session broke up, I just went over to her and I said, are you okay? You seem very upset. And she sort of said,
Doctor, you've been asked this question before, is that correct, by me in terms of explaining what happened during this incident?
yes.
Can you describe what Kathie Durst's demeanor was at the time that you had this conversation? I want to start with her demeanor during the incident.
She appeared extremely frightened, way more than somebody would ordinarily appear sitting in a class. She appeared very frightened, very anxious.
In fact, have you used the word petrified previously to describe, have you used the word petrified to describe Kathie Durst's demeanor?
I did use that word. She did appear petrified.
And do you consider that word petrified to accurately describe what her demeanor was?
I did.
Doctor, as a psychiatrist, how many individuals do you think you've interviewed and counseled during your career?
1,000.
And have you had experience with individuals who are going through trying or emotional times?
Yes.
And doctor, the conversation that was going on between Kathie Durst and the attending physician, you indicated that it was, the word you used was what to describe it?
I'm not sure what I used before, but I'll say now, it was a very straightforward, simple question, and there was nothing particularly, there was nothing about the situation that one would have expected to make she or any medical student anxious in the least.
And her response to that question, you were saying that as a fellow medical student, as a psychiatrist, you found to be unrelated or disproportional to whatever she was asked.
Well, her behavior, she didn't respond at all. She didn't answer the question.
And her behavior, as best you can remember, what did she do?
She sort of looked frozen and very anxious in a way that struck me as concerning.
And what led you to use the word when you went to speak with her afterwards that she appeared to be petrified?
Well, just as I said, her facial expression, the fact that she kind of didn't seem to be really processing the question that was asked. She seemed to be lost in some thought. She looked very frightened.
Did you ask her what was wrong?
I did.
And what did she tell you?
She couldn't say nothing.
Well, you can answer. I asked you if you asked her what.
Yeah, I went out to her after that class ended and said, "Are you okay? You seem upset." And she just said, "I'm fine," or just kind of dismissed it, and that was all that happened at that time.
And when you asked her, could you tell if she still appeared to be upset?
I guess I would say probably not as upset as she seemed in the moment that I was so concerned. It was just a passing shadow.
Shortly thereafter, did you receive a phone call from Catheter?
That evening,
When she called, can you please describe what her demeanor was on the phone?
she was very upset.
And can you please describe exactly what led you to that conclusion?
Well, it was a combination of what she was telling me and how she was sounding. But what she was telling me was extremely upsetting.
How was her voice shaking?
Her voice was shaking. She was talking fast. And she, in a tenor of a very, very, very anxious person.
Do you recall specifically what you related about this conversation you had with Catheter to me during a recorded conversation of 2016?
I believe so.
What's that?
I believe I recall.
I'm asking if you recall fully everything that you said about this
Yes.
conversation. All right. Do you recall telling me that her voice was shaking?
I do.
Do you recall telling me that she was clearly very anxious?
I do.
Do you recall telling me that she had a pressured speech?
I do.
Do you recall telling me that she was clearly very upset?
I do.
What did Kathie say to you?
Kathie said that she was very frightened because she thought that her husband might hurt her.
And did she say those words to you?
Yes, she did. She said that there were problems in the marriage and that things had escalated to the point that she felt unsafe. She said that her husband was capable of violence and told a story to support that, in which she said that a friend of hers had been visiting their apartment, and that when her husband came home, he was very upset that this man was in the apartment and physically assaulted that man, including kicking him in the head. And she just said that she was extremely frightened that maybe something would happen to her.
At this point in time, Dr. Halperin, would you have called Kathie Durst a close friend?
Absolutely not.
Would you even have called her more of a friend or an acquaintance?
An acquaintance.
When she told you this, how did you respond to her? What did you tell her?
I immediately said, "You really should leave and get out of this situation. I'm very concerned that you're at a risk. Why don't you just leave?"
And doctor, did you say the way that you just described was in a very kind of calm and more advisory tone? Is that the tone you had with her?
I try to stay calm and advisory even in the most pressing situation. I'm not really certain what my tone of voice was, but the content was, "I'm extremely concerned for your safety. This sounds like a dangerous situation." I suggested that we should continue with the conversation. Or
Do you recall when you said that to her, did she agree to immediately leave the situation?
no, she did not.
What did she tell you, if you can remember?
She said that she felt that she would be jeopardizing a settlement in divorce hearings financially if she were to leave.
Did she make clear to you, doctor, during that call that she was specifically frightened of physical violence involving her husband?
The question is, did she express that she was afraid of physical violence against her?
Did she make clear that, I'll do it in two parts, that number one, she was afraid of physical violence against her, and that number two, that concern related to her husband?
Yes, both those things. That was how she initiated the phone call.
And as you sit here right now, if I were to ask you, scale of 0 to 100, how sure are you that she related those two things to you? 0 being not sure at all, 100 being not positive.
100.
At that point in time, did you make Kathie an offer?
I did. I said, I repeated that I felt that she should extract herself from the situation, and I invited her to stay with my wife and I that night. She needed a place.
And did you make that offer more than once?
A couple of times, yeah.
And what was Kathie's response to that offer?
No, no thank you.
And during the discussion of the offers, did the issue of her financial situation come up as well during that discussion?
Yes, she repeated that issue is why she felt that she shouldn't leave. And I said to her, I thought that was a very bad reason not to remove herself.
At the time of the call, were you married?
Yes,
Are you still married to the same woman today?
yes.
And that woman's name is?
Martha Halperin.
And where was your wife during this call that you had with Kathie Durst?
Right next to me.
And were you at home just before cell phones, correct?
Yes. I was at home.
Any idea the time of day or night when this call came in?
Just that it was evening, I think early evening.
And when you said your wife was seated next to you, were you communicating with her while the call was going on?
Yes, I made some comments to her that was, the person who called me was a classmate of mine, and she seemed to be in serious trouble, and she was afraid for her safety.
And so was your wife, to the best of your knowledge, did you make your wife aware that you were going to be offering Kathie to come over and stay with you?
Yeah, I just sort of did a kind of, with her implicit agreement that that was a good idea.
And after the phone call, did you and your wife discuss what had just happened?
Sure.
And did Kathie end up coming over that night?
No, she didn't.
Did you ever see Kathie again after that night?
No, I did not.
Did you ever speak to Kathie again after that night?
No, I did not.
How did you find out that Kathie had disappeared?
I saw a front page of the New York newspaper announcing that she had disappeared, and that there was a bounty order offered by her husband for her return.
And when you saw that article, what did the response did you have as soon as you read it?
My heart sank. I felt that something very bad had happened to Kathie.
Dr. Halperin, the article that you read, that you remember seeing, do you recall any of the tone or subject of that article?
All I recall is that she was missing. There was a description of her as a medical student, and that her husband was offering a reward for any information that would help find her.
And when you saw that, what was your reaction to it?
Well, my reaction was that I was incredulous that
Dr. Halperin, based on what you read, what if anything, or saw on TV, what if anything did you do at that point?
what, if anything, did I do?
Did you make a phone call?
Okay, so that extends. When I read the article before the TV show that on the news that I saw, I believe later that day, my thought was that she may have been killed. And my thought was, based on the conversation that I had with her that I described, that it was not unlikely that her husband perhaps did that.
Dr. Halperin, in reading the article and looking at the coverage, did the article and coverage portray Mr. Durst as a concerned husband?
Yes.
And what was your response to reading and seeing that information? What did you do?
You asked me about whether I made a phone call.
Yes.
Can I talk about the circumstance in which I made a phone call?
Yes. Please explain the circumstances of your phone call.
I believe it was that same evening. There was a newscast describing the fact that Kathie was missing and that her husband was offering her reward. And I called the news station and said I had reason to think that her husband may have been involved with her disappearance.
And what was the response of the news station when you called?
The complete lack of interest in that information. They might have been asking me who I was, or any other questions, and that was the end of the conversation.
I want to go forward. Did you contact the New York Police Department to relate to them the incident that you previously now testified to in court, the phone call?
At that time?
Yes.
No.
And why is that, Doctor?
I believed that something terrible had happened to Kathie, that her husband was a prime suspect in my mind based on our conversation, and that there seemed to be an inordinate amount of sort of control over the press and the TV to the extent that it was extremely intimidating to me to think about saying any more.
I just want to make sure, Mr. Ray indicated that there was no evidence about the NYPD. I thought I asked you and I thought you responded. Did the NYPD ever contact you regarding Catheter's disappearance?
Only after I initiated contact in, I believe, 2003 or so.
Let me, Ken, this is my question really carefully. I'm only asking about the New York Police Department, NYPD. I'm not talking about the Westchester County DA's office.
I did not call the New York Police Department.
And my question is, did the New York Police Department ever contact you?
No, not then. Only in 2003.
In 2003, you were contacted by the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, Geneva Bureau, and New York State Police. Is that correct?
Yes, I contacted
You
her.
contacted them, is that correct? And then they came out and interviewed you, correct?
On the phone.
To this day, have you ever been contacted by the New York Police Department?
Oh, no, I guess not.
All right, I want to go back to a moment to the rotations at,
Am I allowed to ask whether I can complete the answer to the question of why I didn't call the police? Because that was not the only reason.
Right.
Mr. Loon, if you want to ask him now, that's the only way I'm going to hear it.
if you trust me, I promise,
Okay.
the last area that I asked you,
Okay.
I won't forget. I promise that.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, when you are talking about a medical school rotation in your fourth year when you're about to graduate, how important is it to show up for the first day?
Very important.
And when you say very important, can you describe the physical condition based on your experience, both having attended Einstein Medical School and also in your position at Stony Brook? Based on your experience, how sick would an individual have to be not to show up?
Extremely sick. I mean, it's certainly maybe more true back then than it is now. It's still very true that medical students take these rotations extremely seriously. And the phrase that's often used to describe it is, you show up, even if you have to drag the IV ball with you.
And that's a phrase you used previously when I asked you about this, is that correct?
Yes.
I want to ask you, based on your experience, I want you to assume the following. You have a fourth-year medical student who is within 2 months of graduating. They are going to be doing an outpatient pediatric rotation. And I want you to assume that that individual is ill. Can you explain to me, who would you expect that person to call?
They would call the physician responsible for running that rotation, usually the attending physician at the, involved with that rotation, pediatrician who is running that clerkship.
And another way that's referred to is, we talk about the service, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
So you have a group of doctors, attendings, and other residents who are at that rotation. They are expecting you as a fourth year to be reporting and doing work. Is that correct?
Yes.
What kind of work would a fourth year, nearly graduating medical student be doing on an outpatient pediatric rotation?
They would be assigned patients to evaluate under the supervision of the teaching doctors.
So would that mean then that if an individual is scheduled to start, let's say, that morning at 9 o'clock, are there going to be patients that they're going to be expected to be handled? They're the primary contact.
At some point during that day, yes.
And when you said you would expect a call to go to the person handling the rotation, somebody on the service, is that different than the medical school itself?
Yes.
And can you explain the difference between the two?
Well, the medical school is the centralized mechanism that oversees everything that medical students do ultimately. But when you're on a clinical rotation, you're not in the class, you're not even on the campus of the medical school, you're in some clinical setting at a hospital or outpatient clinic. And your sort of line of reporting and your relationship is with the teaching doctors at that service that you're assigned to.
Doctor, is it fair to say that if you take that same medical student and they are calling ill that day, they're not going to be the first day of an outpatient pediatric rotation. If you call the dean of the medical school, is that going to let the people who are expecting you know that you're not going to have?
Well, not unless you ask the dean to call them.
You actually took part in these same rotations when you were a medical student at Montefiore and I'm asking about that, correct?
Yes.
Doctor, my question is, and let me finish. When you were advised that Kathie Durst had allegedly called the dean to report herself sick, but had not called the service she was supposed to be on, what was your response?
In our conversation,
Doctor, did you at some point hear, it doesn't matter where you heard, but did you hear that Kathie Durst had allegedly called the dean to report herself sick, but had not called the service she was assigned to?
what I heard independently,
Did you hear that?
I heard that
Yes, I know. Did you hear that?
I heard that she had called the dean. I did not hear that she had not called the service.
Good.
At a certain point in time, Doctor, and that's what you meant, was it represented to you
At a certain point in time,
Yes.
subsequently to that, yes.
that Kathie Durst had allegedly, it was being argued that Kathie Durst had called the dean, but had not called the attending
Just
physician?
at a later point in time.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was your response when you heard that?
It was the same response that,
Can you answer?
I'm sorry, please repeat the question.
Doctor, I want you to assume the following hypothetical. I want you to assume that a fourth-year medical student about to graduate is starting their first day of acute pediatric rotation in Montefiore in 1982. Okay. All right, doctor, I want you to assume the following hypothetical. You have a fourth-year medical student who is at Albert Einstein Medical School near the end of their 4th year in 1982. A time, correct, when you were at that medical school and knew the policies and procedures. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Okay, so continue with hypothetical. I want you to assume that that person is ill for the first day of acute pediatrics rotation. I want you to further assume that it is alleged that that person called to report themselves ill to the dean and did not contact the service they were supposed to be reporting to that day. In your opinion, doctor, would that kind of conduct be consistent with what you have ever observed a fellow medical student or any medical student you supervise to have done?
It would not be consistent.
And can you explain why?
First and foremost, because any medical student would know, especially 4th year, not the first day of the very first rotation and then the 3rd year, that the person to communicate that you're going to be absent with is the team that you're being assigned to as a clinical rotating student. And that they need to know that you're not going to be there, not just because you're sort of missing class, the way that might happen, in anatomy, because you know that you're really part of a clinical team and that you might have patients assigned and that they need to know that those patients need to be reassigned, etc. And that's the person that you call.
And doctor, someone who's worked, you function in a dean's role at Stony Brook, correct?
Not in a dean's role. I had a fairly senior position in the medical school curriculum committee, but I was not a dean.
You understand, though, from your experience at Stony Brook and also your experience at Einstein, how the procedures would work involving somebody not showing up for a rotation?
Of course, yes.
And, doctor, would you agree that if you simply called the dean and did not call the service you're supposed to be showing up to, then that service is still expecting you to be there, handling patients, etc. Is that correct?
Yes, and it would be unheard of to call the dean.
And, doctor, you were previously asked this question during our interview in 2016, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall the exact answer that you gave to me at that time?
I think I may have used a word that perhaps, it's editable.
Do you, as you said, do you remember the exact series of words and responses that you gave me? PH 16, Your Honor. This is going to be this is on the 225-16 interview, page 20, lines 22 through 28.
April 65.
To page 21, lines 1 through 2.
Do I have this document?
Huh?
Do I have this document?
No.
Are you going to mark it now as an exhibit?
Yes, Pencil 65, 65A was either transfer.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Yes. Does that accurately reflect your views? It does. And again, I want to go to the next step. Even assuming that someone had called the dean, Can you imagine a circumstance where they would have not called the service they were supposed to report to?
No, I cannot.
I want to go back to your conduct in this case, particularly you indicated that in approximately 2003, you contacted the authorities, is that correct?
Yes, I contacted, I believe, District Attorney in Westchester.
And can you tell me, Doctor, was there another reason? You had mentioned before you wanted to state a second reason as to why you did not come forward in 1982.
I felt that, given the fact that I had no relationship with Kathie, that there had to be many people in her life who knew as much or more about what was happening in her life, happening in her marriage tonight, and that that information would be made available. It just seemed to me that, given the fact that I had talked in a certain way, I would say that was the only conversation I ever had with her, and knew nothing else about her life or marriage or anything else, that there had to be other people who were going to be talking to authorities, and by the due diligence of any investigation, you know, actual friends of hers would be talked to. And in that sense, I'm not surprised I was never contacted in the sense that I had no relationship with her. So I just figured that that made, you know, my input less important.
Doctor, was there another reason as well why you didn't choose to come forward in 1982?
Well, that other reason was that I thought I might be putting myself at personal risk.
And when you say personal risk, can you explain what you mean with personal risk?
I'm sorry?
When you say personal risk, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I was of the belief that Kathie had come to a potentially violent end, and that the person who might be responsible was an extremely powerful person who seemed to be able to kind of put a spin on the media already, and that it might not be the safest thing in the world to confront.
And that person you didn't name, that person is Mr. Durst.
Yes.
As you sit here today, Dr. Halperin, did you want to testify in this case?
No.
Why are you here today?
I would start the answer to that question with why I called the district attorney in 2003.
You know, let me ask that. I should cover that. What made you call the district attorney's office in 2003 when you would not contact anybody in 1982?
I became aware in a newspaper article that that district attorney had reopened the case involving Kathie. And I was also aware at that point that there was a whole other circumstance in which there was a person who was killed in Galveston, Texas, and that Mr. Durst was involved, though not found guilty. And the confluence of those two things were such that I really felt that it was my responsibility to let her know that there might be some information that I had, this exact information, that would be relevant to her case if it was reopened.
By let her know, you mean the district attorney was just...
Yes, so I called that up.
And Dr. Halperin, in terms of your testimony here today, is it fair to say that you were told that you could come out here voluntarily or we would have to subpoena you?
You did say that.
And is it fair to say that in the end, you're out here not so much because of choice, but because we told you one of two ways, either subpoena or voluntary?
I guess that's fair, yes.
As you sit here today, right now, are you still afraid of Mr. Durst?
I'm sorry.
As you sit here today, are you still afraid of Mr. Durst, either directly or indirectly?
Well, I would say less than I was in 1982, but there's some feeling that, state of mind I have in the situation that may not be 100% safe.
Would the record reflect there was a definite shrug of the shoulders before answering?
Record shall also reflect in the video as well.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Yes. Dr. Halperin, did you know Kathie Durst well enough to know that she was having some academic problems at the time?
I did not know that she was having academic difficulties.
Did you know whether she had a relationship, I don't mean by that romantic relationship, but a relationship with the dean and the assistant dean, Dr. Cook?
No.
Do you remember that the assistant dean was Dr. Jean, J-E-A-N, that's French pronunciation, Cook?
Yes, I remember Dr. Cook.
And Dr. Cooperman was the dean?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
Dr. Cook was the dean of medical students, I believe. And Dr. Cooperman was the dean of the medical school.
right. You've been characterized, Dr. Cook, as being assistant dean, but is that incorrect?
Typically, there's a separate dean for medical students, and it may be that it's called an assistant, but he was the dean for medical students.
Okay. Were you on the rotation with Kathie Durst that she called in to say she was sick about?
No.
Do you know what time it started in the morning?
No. I would guess 8 or 9 in the morning, but I don't know.
Do you know where it was to be?
No.
These sort of rotations, and this was a rotation involving pediatrics of some sort. You nodded your head. Were you aware that it was a pediatric rotation?
At some point, yes, I'm aware that it was pediatric rotation.
At the time of this?
At the time, I had no idea what she was doing, what rotation was.
Okay. Well, you didn't have any idea when the rotation started in the day, did you? Like the hour of the day?
Not specifically, rotations start usually fairly early in the morning, but I have no idea exactly what time that rotation started.
By fairly early in the morning, what time?
It could be as early as 7 to 9.
Okay. And would it be at a location away from the school?
Almost 100%.
Probably at a hospital?
Or a clinic. If it was an outpatient rotation, it could be a freestanding outpatient clinic. It doesn't have to be at a hospital.
Okay, and you said that the size of the rotations were generally around 10 students?
I said the size of that radiology rotation was about 10. They really can vary. You can have a rotation with literally one student. So it all depends on the structure of that rotation.
So what I'm hearing is that you don't know the size of this particular rotation that Kathie Durst missed.
I know absolutely nothing about that rotation.
And of course, you said you know absolutely nothing, but that would include that you don't know what doctor was in charge of it, or where it would be.
I know nothing about the rotation.
Do some rotations occur in a hospital where they go from room to room to see the patients?
Yes.
This was a time when there were no cell phones, right?
That's right.
And so if Kathie had missed the 7 o'clock call for the rotation, and there were no cell phones, how would she have contacted the doctor in charge of that rotation, as opposed to calling Dr. Cook or calling Dr. Cooper?
When you're assigned a rotation, you're assigned contact information, including a phone to call in such circumstances.
But of course, a doctor conducting a rotation, taking the students around with him in the hospital, for instance, the contact number wouldn't work, would it?
Well, for one thing, the rotation probably didn't involve a doctor going from room to room, because I believe I was told it was an outpatient rotation. The other, we did have beepers back then, and that number would have been available.
Do you know whether Dr. John Cook was available that morning for a phone call?
The dean?
Yes.
I have no idea.
Do you know whether he was actually not at the school that morning?
I have no idea where Dean Cook was that morning.
Okay. So if Kathie had difficulty, well, let me start. If Kathie had missed the 7 o'clock beginning of the rotation, and the rotation was then wherever it was, with the lack of cell phones, you say there were beepers, but with the lack of cell phone, and the rotation maybe had already started and Kathie missed the start of the rotation, then Dr. Jean Cook would be a person to whom she would be able to reach, because he's usually in his office. Was Dr. Cook?
I don't know about that. What I know is
Hold on a
that
second.
she would have been able to have Dr. Page at the rotation.
Dr. Cook had an office, didn't he?
Sure.
And to your knowledge, was Dr. Cook generally available by telephone in his office? You can answer that yes or no. Or
I assume yes.
Okay. And if he was out, for instance, out of town, would someone else take his calls?
I would assume yes.
Would that be Dr. Cooperman or Dr. Cooperman's secretary?
That wouldn't be my first guess.
Well, I'm not asking you to guess.
I would assume that Dr. Cook would have a secretary, not Dr. Cooperman, to take that call.
Let's assume for a moment that Dr. Cooperman's office was taking Dr. Cook's calls in Dr. Cook's absence. You wouldn't contest that that is a possibility, would you?
I would not.
Okay. So if Kathie couldn't reach the doctor in charge of the rotation and wanted to report that she was ill, it is possible that she could call.
No,
Yes, she could.
not in my opinion, because I don't think it's possible that you could not reach the doctor in charge of the rotation, because those doctors have to carry beepers for all of their work, way beyond their teaching work, and they're always available. And the student would have called the paging service to have that doctor paged.
When did
Medical
you,
doctors are reachable at all hours.
when did you hear and how did you hear? That's two questions really. When and how did you hear that Kathie had called Dr. Cooperman, the dean?
The one I'm not sure I can answer. The how was I actually read about it in an article about this whole unfolding situation. And I read that Kathie was reported to have called the dean, didn't say Cooperman or Cook, to report her absence.
Give us a ballpark of when you read that. You said you couldn't tell us exactly when. Was it contemporaneously with the facts going on, that is, in early 82, or was it sometime later?
I really don't recall that. I really don't recall. Because I've read, different times over the years, there have been articles about this, and I really cannot say, but I believe it was earlier than later. In an article talking about the situation with Kathie's disappearance, it was stated in the article that, somebody had called the dean's office when she missed a day in a rotation, and that's when I became aware, and I found that kind of striking, because I didn't believe that was a likely thing to have happened.
Okay, but your answer is that you don't recall if that's when it was.
I don't recall.
You mentioned that, you mentioned beepers. Was it absolutely necessary that if you got a beep, you immediately return the call?
Yeah.
Did you wear a beaver as a resident or a year? Okay.
Yes.
And, and now, as to the call that you received from Cathie when she was upset, frightened, and so forth, when was that?
It was the evening that situation had happened in the rotation, so sometime late in December of 1981.
December of 81, and that was all rotation, I think you told us.
In radiology.
In radiology, when she just froze up and didn't answer the question at all.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, so sometime in late 1981?
That evening, the evening of the interaction at the radiology rotation is when she called.
Yes. Is that sometime in late 1981? Is that your testimony?
Yes, December 1981.
And you never talked to her again?
I never talked to her again.
So, at least a month to February of 1982, and whatever was left of 1981 is the time period between when you last had any contact with Catheter and when you learned of her disappearance. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, did you know Cathie well enough to know that she had cocaine habit?
No. No.
Would it be unusual for medical students to be using cocaine back then?
Yes.
You knew of none?
That's the difference between being unusual and whether there's any. Yes, I knew it was something that happened, but it was not a typical or usual.
Did you know Cathie well enough to make a judgment of whether she was using cocaine?
No.
You said she was agitated, she froze up, she appeared to you frightened. Later, when she called you, her voice was shaking, she was talking fast, her demeanor was upset. Are those symptoms that are also common to the use of cocaine?
Some of them talking fast, certainly.
And you told us that you did not call the police when you got the call from Cathie, when she said she was frightened, or you assessed her as being frightened. Is that right?
What I said was I did not call the police after I found out she was missing.
Well, did you call?
But I also did not call the police after.
Well, that was my question. And when you got this call in late 1981, that you described to us, you didn't call the police then. You didn't call anybody then.
No.
And then when you learned of Cathie's disappearance, again, you did not call the police.
Correct.
And the first time that you called the authorities at all was in 2003?
Yes.
Are you aware that for some 30 years, Dr. Cooperman was convinced that the call that he got on February the 1st of 1982 was from Cathie?
I am not aware of that. What kind of call?
Well, you said it would be very unusual for a medical student to call the dean because they didn't want the dean to know that they might have missed a rotation. That doesn't take into account whatever relationship may have existed between the dean and the medical student, does it?
I would say correct, it does not.
Would it change your opinion any if you knew that for 30 years Dr. Cooperman didn't question that he was called by Cathie?
Would it change what?
Your opinion that it was bullshit, as you expressed it so colorfully.
Yes, it would change my opinion.
So, okay. Doctor, would anything change your opinion about the fact that even if Kathie Durst were going to call Dr. Cooperman, that you would have absolutely expected her to have called the service that she was supposed to be reporting to as well?
It would not change that opinion. First and foremost, that would be the person that I would expect her to call.
You were also asked, Doctor, on cross-examination regarding whether Kathie Durst might have been under the influence of cocaine when you were speaking with her. Do you recall that by Mr. DeGuerin during the phone call?
I know.
He asked.
He didn't. He asked if some of the. He described some of the
Oh, you just
behavior and
well,
I'm sorry. Excuse me. I wasn't sure of the name. Yes, I recall that was that.
Was there anything about the phone call that you had with Kathie Durst that caused you to believe that she was under the influence of anything other than intense fear and terror involving her husband?
That was all I heard and responded to. You know, thank you. I think I answered the question. Thank you. Additional questions for this one? Yeah. Yes? I made the witness the excuse. Any objection? You're excused, doctor. Thank you.
All right. Do you have exhibits to mark?
I would like to mark People's 55B as an exhibit sheet, which correlates that exhibit 65A mentioned in the conditional exam, which was a 2-page transcript. We'd now like to mark that as People's 55C for edification. And then I have People's 55C, that's that 2-page transcript.
All right, they may be marked. All right, your next witness, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Your Honor. It is the stipulated conditional examination videotape testimony of Trooper James Harney, Harney. May I mark the video as People's 56 and the transcript as People's 56A.
Yes, yes, you may.
May I pass to the jurors who need a
Yes.
chance? They're also subtitled.
Okay, this is for me. Hey.
Everyone's got a copy? Okay.
Yes, I believe we can proceed.
Thank you. You may play the video.
Yes.
Well, James Harney.
Okay, this screen is off again.
Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the House authentic before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Thank you.
Please share closer to the mic. Thank you. Please state and spell your first and last name.
James Harney, Harney.
Thank you.
You may proceed, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you. Good morning.
One,
Would you please just state your age for the court, please?
65.
65. And what is your current occupation?
I'm retired.
What are you retired from?
I retired from the New York State Police.
For how many years were you with the New York State Police?
I was a New York State Trooper for more than 31 years.
And is that a peace officer position?
position? Were you a peace officer?
I was a police officer.
Police officer. Okay. Where did you serve during those 31 approximate years? What areas did you serve?
I began my career as a New York State Trooper at the State Police Brewster Barracks, which is located in Putnam County, New York. I served there for about 1 year. I transferred to State Police Somers, which is in northern Westchester County, and I served there for approximately 4 years.
What about after that?
For a period of those 4 years, I was assigned to the State Police Lewisboro Satellite Office, which is in the town of Lewisboro. After that, I was appointed as an investigator in the New York State Police, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. I was assigned to our SB Manhattan office, which was located at the time at 2 World Trade Center in Manhattan. I served there for a few years as an investigator. The following year, after my appointment as an investigator, I was appointed to the permanent rank of sergeant. But I remained in my position as an investigator. In 1986, I was appointed as a lieutenant in the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, still assigned to our offices in the World Trade Center. In 1989, I was appointed as a captain in the Uniformed Force, transferred to Long Island, where I was assistant troop commander to the major. Troop L, as it is known, is predominantly tasked with providing police patrols on the parkways of Long Island and performing patrol functions on the eastern end of Long Island in the Hamptons area. I served there for about 1 year and was appointed as the captain of the Violent Felony Warrant Squad, which brought me back to Westchester County. That was a statewide unit tasked with apprehending dangerous felons wanted throughout the state and wanted by other agencies. In 1994, I was appointed as Major, the Troop Commander for State Police Operations in New York City. I served in that capacity until 2000, when I was appointed as a Staff Inspector and transferred to Albany, New York, which is where Division Headquarters is located. I was assigned to the Internal Affairs Unit at that time. I was in that position for about 2 years, and then transferred back to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation at Division Headquarters, working under the Assistant Deputy Superintendent for the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. In 2004, I was appointed as Director of Human Resources for the New York State Police, and I served in that position as Lieutenant Colonel, the military rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Assistant Deputy Superintendent. I served in that position for about 3 or 4 years. I was appointed as Deputy Superintendent at Division Headquarters with the rank of Colonel, assigned to the Superintendent's office. I was in that position for 1 year until my retirement in 2008.
So the highest position that you eventually achieved within the New York State Police was Colonel, and it was the Deputy to the Superintendent?
It was Deputy Superintendent, yes.
Deputy Superintendent. So how many employees are there, peace officers, let's say, in the New York State Police?
In the New York State Police, there are approximately 5,000, I'll call them all state troopers, because that's really our permanent rank, whether they're colonels or whether they're troopers or lieutenants. Approximately 5,000 state troopers, approximately a workforce of 1,000 civilian support.
Okay, so a total of approximately 6,000 employees, including support as well as law enforcement?
Yes, that's correct.
And in your final position as the Deputy Superintendent, how many people worked above you?
There was one person above me. He was the Superintendent of State Police.
And approximately 6,000 people below you?
That's approximately, yes.
Okay. What was your assignment? I'm going to take you back to February of 1982.
In 1982, I was a trooper. I'll call him a trooper on patrol. I was assigned in 1982 to the State Police Lewisboro Satellite Station, and my responsibility was basically the trooper providing police services in the town of Lewisboro. Not to say that it wouldn't take me to other towns in the adjoining towns if there wasn't a trooper in say, Pound Ridge, which was just south of Lewisboro, I would respond to the calls for service in that town. But my emphasis was the trooper for the town of Lewisboro.
And are you familiar with an area referred to as South Salem in Westchester County?
Yes, I am. That's actually where our satellite station was located.
And is South Salem within the jurisdiction of the Lewisboro station?
Yes, it is. That's South Salem is, I'll call it a hamlet in the town of Lewisboro.
Okay. For how many years were you at Lewisboro, did you say?
I was at Lewisboro for about 3 to 4 years.
And you mentioned Somers. Is that S-O-M-E-R-S?
That's correct.
What's the relationship between the Somers station and the Lewisboro station? Is there a relationship between them?
Yes, there is. So Somers is the control station, as we call it. When you get transferred to a station, you would be transferred, in this case, to Somers, which I was. I was transferred from Brewster to Somers. And then the station commander has a prerogative of taking you and assigning you to the satellite stations under the control of Somers.
So Lewisboro, if I'm understanding you correctly, is a substation under the Somers barracks?
That's correct.
Okay. And what were your, as a trooper in the Lewisboro station at that period of time, what were your main duties? What would you do on a daily basis?
On a daily basis, it would be maybe vehicle traffic enforcement, responding to calls for service, could be accident investigations, it runs the gamut.
Okay. If somebody makes a call and requests some sort of service or investigation, it may be assigned to you to follow up?
That's correct.
Okay. If you're driving around patrolling, you may be enforcing the traffic laws as well?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. How many, so we can just figure out how large Lewisboro is, how many troopers would be on duty at a time during each shift? At that period of time in 1982?
Sure, well, there may be 25 to 30 troopers assigned to State Police Somers overall, which includes the satellite stations, Pound Ridge and Lewisboro. So at any one time in the years I was there were either 2 troopers assigned to Lewisboro or maybe 5, given the time period. But basically all the troopers were assigned to Somers. Lewisboro, we ran anywhere from 2 to 5 troopers at any given year.
Okay, and of those 2 to 5 troopers, how many were actually out patrolling at a time, say from, 8 in the morning until noon, one shift?
It depended on the shift, it depended on the schedule. Certain times of the month, you might have more troopers working on a particular day or 2. But in my case, I was the trooper on patrol most of the times for the town of Lewisboro.
Okay.
And it would be the same for North Salem. There might be 1 trooper for North Salem, 1 trooper for Pound Ridge, but there were never many troopers working in the 4 towns.
5 or less, usually 1 or 2.
Yes.
And what, geographically, square mileage wise, how large is that area that 1 to 2 people or 1 to 5 people are patrolling?
I'm going to estimate the town of Lewisboro could be 15, 20 square miles.
Okay. At that point in time, in February 1982, you've been a peace officer approximately, is it 5 years?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had any homicide investigations as of that period of time?
Homicide training or?
Investigations. Had you been involved in any investigations up to that point?
No, other than maybe as a trooper at a homicide scene, you would be involved in securing the perimeter of, say, a residence where a homicide had occurred.
But where you were the individual who was actually investigating the homicide?
No.
No. What was the extent of your training in that area at this point in time? Homicide.
Up to this point, any homicide training course was received at the State Police Basic School Academy.
Okay. So basically, whatever training you received in the academy was it in terms of homicides?
Yes, and there may have been an in-service training. Troopers had.
Your Honor, we're about at the noon hour. I've stopped People's 56 at 11 minutes and 5 seconds.
Thank you. That makes sense to me. A good place to stop. Ladies and gentlemen, this thing works. We'll recess until 1:30. Remember, do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until after you've discussed the case with the other jurors during deliberations. We'll see you at 1:30.